All right. Thank you. Teams, are we good? All right, good evening. So let's get to it. So last night we kicked off our discussion on IFRS 3, and we picked up that this is the only standard that allows us to recognize goodwill. We then realized that goodwill is it comprises a number of factors. One of them is consideration. One of them it's also fair value principles, measurement of NCI, and the recognition principle. Then we agreed that we're going to break down the understanding accordingly. And in that regard, what we then did was we started our discussion on consideration. We spent time clarifying, and we saw how it was applied on Joe. Then we went a bit further, and we also saw the principle being applied on the principles being applied for the recognition. Under recognition, we spoke about the fact that before we recognize something, it has to meet the definition of the framework, and also it has to be identifiable. And we did mention that identifiability talks to what? Identifiability simply talks to whether it's separable or whether it arises from a contract. And those are the requirements that will allow us to recognize an asset that never existed before. Then we went a step further and we spoke about leases, and we saw how to account for situations where the lessee, where the acquiree or the subsidiary is a lessee. And we also saw an instance where the acquiree is a lessee or a lessor. Don't know which one I said first. Then to conclude, I'll want us to talk about what? I'll want us to talk about this contingent liability and an indemnification asset. So the question is, we know very well that a contingent liability is not something that you recognize. So it is not something that you recognize in the separate financial statements of a company. And that is IS 37. IS 37 gives us that guidance, and it is absolutely clear why not. And now we are sitting here and we are realizing that, oh no, hold on. IFRS 3 seems to be suggesting something different. IFRS 3 is suggesting that we can recognize a contingent liability. But for you to recognize it, there need to be two conditions that are met. There need to be two conditions that are met. What are those conditions? Condition number one is that they have to be a present obligation. In other words, there has to be a past event. So a past event is where there is an admission of guilt that, yes, officer, I did pass the stop sign, therefore I broke the law. Yes, officer, I was speeding, therefore I broke the law. Yes, I stole these trade secrets. Yes, I contravened the Competition Act. So they need to be what? They need to be something that causes a liability to exist. But remember that skipping a stop sign does not mean that you're going to pay a fine. You will pay a fine only if you get caught. And that's why a contingent liability, or you breaking the law, or a present obligation, does not mean that what? You will have to pay a fine. It just means that you contravened an existing regulation or an existing law. So that is what we are talking about here. That for it to be recognized, there has to be this past event. It's so important in the overall mix of things. Because I'm saying that if I'm buying the company from you, I might find myself having to pay a penalty at a later point. So that is number one. Number two is that they need to be an acquisition date fair value. So these are the two requirements that need to be met. So if they are not there, then do not do what? Do not do not recognize a contingent liability. And sometimes after recognizing a contingent liability, there is a need to do what? To recognize, there's a need to recognize what we call an indemnification asset. And the standard says that an indemnification asset can only be recognized if the contingent liability is recognized. So you can never have a an indemnification asset if you concluded that there's no contingent liability. So the two always work together, because it says that the asset has to indemnify something that has been what? That has been recognized. So if there is no recognition of the item, then there is no what? There is no recognition of an asset as well. And that is what we are saying. So in that long journal entry, we will then have debit indemnification asset, SFP. On the credit, we will then have contingent liability, SFP. So that is what we are saying. They will always go together. But because this is a contingent liability, it is contingent or therefore dependent on an asset existing. So when we go to an asset, we will then realize what? So it is contingent on something happening. So the contingency means that there is a future event that is uncertain and therefore may or may not occur. All right, that's number one. So it may or it may not occur. That's number one. Then number two, it is what? Number two means that if in the future the uncertainty is resolved, you don't care how it is resolved. Did we have to pay? Yes. Did we have not to pay? Yes. Did we just settle? Was the lawsuit cancelled? So whatever the outcome is in the future, it means that there is no contingency anymore. And therefore, what do? We have to reverse the contingent liability. And then we have to do what? We have to reverse the asset as well. And any difference between these two will be recognized in P&L. But you will always do this. So this is always when the outcome is resolved. So do not be confused by what is the outcome, but rather focus on what? Rather focus on the fact that there is a resolution of the outcome. So now these principles were tested under what? These principles were tested when we were looking at what? At Joe. So let us just quickly do it. Let us just quickly look at them before we jump off. Because as I said, Joe had required a very strong application of what? A very strong application of fair value, of phase 3 principle. So let us just go to Joe. Joe, here we are. So Joe, what we've got, let's first start with the recognition principle because we never got to discuss it. Remember that yesterday we had a patent and we said the patent was recognized. So therefore the issue with the patent was it was not sitting at fair value. And you will then see that the patent was carried at a cost of what? Was carried at a cost of 750. So that is number one of what we are identifying about the patent. It was carried at a carrying amount of what? A carrying amount of, or cost of 750. That was number one. Then number two, we then realized that what? We then realized that we need to do a fair value to move it from what the carrying amount will have been and compared to the fair value at acquisition date. So this will have given us the fair value adjustment. Then the next thing, it is to do what? It is to read this information here. So let's read the information together. What are they saying? They say the patent is also licensed to a company for use in its operation. Do you agree that the license is a contract? Do you agree that the license is a contract? Does that make sense? That the license is a contract. And if the license is a contract, it means that we need to make sure that we recognize these cash flows as what? We recognize these cash flows as an asset. So we recognize these cash flows as an asset. So that is what we are saying here. Then what we need to do, what we then need to do, it means that we need to present value the future cash flows. And when we present value these cash flows, we will then present value based on what? Based on this market related fee. And we'll then determine the present value, which will mean that we're gonna have a new asset. So we'll have the patent and we'll have a new asset called what? Called the license agreement. So that is what you needed to pick up with regards to the recognition principle. Then we have what? We then have the lawsuit. So we have the lawsuit. So when it comes to the lawsuit, it was then a matter of what? Of understanding, can we recognize the lawsuit as what? Can we recognize the lawsuit as a contingent liability? What did you conclude on? What did you conclude on? Were you going to recognize the contingent liability, the lawsuit as a contingent liability? So let's read. We said that, okay, we are requiring two things. So in this case, they said to us what? They said that the employee admitted to taking the encrypted memory stick. And because of that, what it essentially means, it means that we are looking for fair value. The fair value was also given as 400,000. So we've got something that gives rise to a present obligation for taking the what? For taking the stick from the previous employer, because that is the issue here. And the stick was said to have what? To have illegally copied some of the design. So the fact that they've taken a stick was then considered here to be what? To be what is the present obligation. Then number two, it was then the fair value is given, meaning that we could recognize the contingent liability. And if the contingent liability could be recognized, we can now argue about recognizing what? We can recognize the indemnification asset. We can recognize the indemnification asset. So that is what we then needed to do for the purpose of determining the goodwill in Ben. Then the other thing that we need to now, so those are the last thing that we needed to look at when it comes to IFRS 3. But let's then quickly do what? So we have addressed this, that it's an asset. We have now addressed what? The liability. Now let's look at the last principle of IFRS 3. So the last principle of IFRS 3. So that is the one relating to measurement. So CTA level 1 will then appreciate that when they look at what? When they look at their test for last year or the exam for last year, it actually spent a bit more time looking at what? Looking at the measurement principle. So let's then now do what? Let's then now look at it. Then the measurement principle, what we are saying that the general principle is that all assets need to be measured at what? All assets need to be measured at the acquisition date fair value. So all the assets and liabilities